First of all, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the program itself, the Answer Clinic. This was started way back in 1972 in the Tacoma Mall with a trial clinic. So we're coming up on our 50th anniversary. In fact, the year after that, 1973, Dr. David Gibby of Washington State University started the first Master Gardener program in Washington State, which was also the first in the United States of America, and then went on to become established in Canada. So the origins of the Master Gardener program is in Washington State, and we're very proud of that. We're a group of about 45 volunteers who have passed the Master Gardener training, then gone on to do more training so we can be better qualified to research answers that the public may bring in to us. Normally, we'd be at our office at the Heritage Farm on 78th Street in Vancouver, Washington, but with the COVID pandemic, we're working from home. This gives us some opportunities to do more in-depth research, but it also limits us in a way because we're very used to having clients bring in examples of their problems, be it an ailing plant or an unidentified weed or an insect that they may have trapped. So we're dependent on the public to help us out with photographs and other ways of identifying the problems. It's hard to think now that 2 months ago, many of us would have been out in our garden right now, looking at our flowers, picking the last tomatoes, and putting the garden to bed. And it's a time of reflection for us gardeners as we look back on our successes and some of our failures, if you can call them failures. And so it is with the ACE Clinic. We like to look back on the last year and look at some of the examples that we've looked at and compare them with times past. And so it is tonight, we're going to take you through some of our favorite case studies we've had over the year and to link them with some other that we've seen in the past. So again, I'd like to welcome my fellow ACEs. We've got the Queen of Plant Problem Pathology, Rebecca Martin. We've got the Laird of the Lawn, John Moore, and the Doyenne of Diagnosis, Karen Palmer. Myself, Nigel Cundy, who sometimes I call the Prince of simply pottering about the garden. So next, let's get on with our first case. Thank you, Karen. This is a rhododendron, as many of you will know. It's also a rhododendron with some rather ugly blotches on, and it's also a rhododendron that was in my own garden. It still is, actually. And I came across this late 2019, in the summer of late 2019. And I thought to myself, as a trainee back then, I was a trainee in the Master Gardener program, and we were going through the plant pathology section of the course, which Erica leads. And I thought to myself, this looks very, very nasty. Next slide, please. We might be having a little bit of delay there. So as being in my own garden and as a newbie, I was thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this is the worst case scenario. I've got a problem here. I've got something called Phytophthora fungal blight, or even worse, it could be the Remorum leaf blight, which is charmingly known also as sudden oak death. The latter is a relatively new, a rare arrival into Clark County and potentially very serious. So I was in a bit of a, at once I was a bit of a panic, and the other thing I was thinking, oh, I've got something I can show the class that's really, really bad. But I brought some samples into Erica. Next slide, please. And she said, wait a minute, cool your jets here. Let's have a look at this. Let's see what it is. Let's talk about whether this could be coming from a living cause or whether it could be coming from an environmental or cultural cause. Not everything's going to be so bad as it seems sometimes. Well, the living causes, we also call biotic causes, and they could be anything that you can't see with the naked eye, such as a virus or a bacteria or a fungal spore. Or it could be something a little bigger that you could see, like a white fly or green fly, aphid, little insect munching away. Or it could be something on a larger scale, like I have in my orchard sometimes when the deer come through, nibble on the branches and knock some over sometimes. Those are what we call biotic causes or living causes. And distinguishing the two is very helpful in establishing the first pathway you go down and identifying a problem. Next slide, please, Karen. Then we have what we call abiotic, which are non-living causes, something ranging from site selection of your plant, be it indoors or outdoors. You could have an indoor plant that's in too much of a sunny exposure or not getting enough light, just as you might outside. And then we also have the fundamental building block, which is soil nutrition. That's what we call cultural issue that we can alter. We can modify that. And then I've got a little picture in the middle of a zealous gardener with his watering can. And watering is a tricky one. We can easily overwater or underwater at any time of the year. And then some of you may see this sometimes. Your neighbor has some weeds in his driveway or on his garden, and he gets out and starts spraying on a windy day or a day that's very humid, and lo and behold, in a couple of weeks, you've got some dead plants. These are what we call abiotic causes. Thank you, Karen. So get back to my poorly rhododendron. And Eric said, let's have a look at this. Let's talk about it. Did the problem appear quickly? No, it did. Yes, it did. It came back quickly in late summer of 2019. And it was regularly distributed. It's not all over the plant. It was on one side of the shrub. And it was only on one of my many rhododendrons in the garden. Everything else seemed to be pretty good. And it wasn't spreading. It wasn't like an organism that suddenly come into the garden and then started spreading around. It was pretty static. And in that case, we'd like to start with assuming that the problem is abiotic. It's something other than a living organism causing the problem. Thank you, Ed. So after that, you should ask the client, in this case myself, can you think of things? Help me out here. Tell me about this plant. Well, this rhododendron has been in place for over 23 years. It's not a new planting. I haven't seen these symptoms before, and I haven't done anything differently. I'm not watering any more or less. I'm not fertilizing. I don't use herbicides, especially that part of the garden. But something's different about this. The plant is in full sunshine after late morning. It gets a lot of sun in the afternoon, and the affected part is on the southwest. So this is my opportunity for my aha moment. I had removed a fairly large-sized shady incense cedar to the west of it in 2018. So that gives us a clue. Next slide, please, Karen. So the preliminary diagnosis is what we start with in the clinic. When we think we know we've got something here we can look at more closely, there's something called sun scald. So then you go on to look at the resources that we have, and I know Rebecca's going to talk about them in a little more detail later on. One of the ones we like to use a lot is from Washington State University. It's called HortSense, and it is a public resource. So anybody can Google it, get in there and start looking around for some answers to your problems. And to quote them, they say, and you can read it for yourself, obviously, but it seems that the leaf blotch with a yellow halo around it is typical of sun scald. And further, HortSense suggests that if I want to do something about it for next year, I can put the shade plant back, or I can irrigate when it gets very hot and dry. I decided that I would actually leave it alone and see what happened. And the next slide, please, Karen. And in 2020, it seems to have acclimatized to the exposure very, very well. We have a nice, healthy rhododendron and has some great flowers this year. Thank you. That's the end of my first case, and now I hand it over to Becca.
Hello. So today I'm going to chat with you about a green bean plant that a client had sent photos in from her vegetable garden, and it had these spots on the pods of the beans. And initially her question was actually whether or not that the beans were safe to eat. And as master gardeners, we do occasionally get questions about whether or not if something is edible or safe to eat. And it's not really in our wheelhouse for answering. We usually find another agency to refer them to. However, looking at the bean, I said, you know, there is something more going on. So let's dig a little deeper into what's going on with your bean plants. And the first thing that we do at the clinic when someone brings in a sample or emails in photos of the sample is we make some observations and we ask questions. And using that information, we start to formulate a diagnosis. So I was looking at the pictures the client had sent in, and I saw the watermark spots on the bean pods that she had photographed really quite well, which was very helpful. I also saw on the leaves these necrotic or dying areas that were surrounded by yellowing of the leaf tissue. And the client had also noted that the problem was spreading throughout her garden patch there. So after looking at the photos, I sent an email back and asked for some more questions about this so I could have some more information. So the client was able to tell me that she had about 100 green beans in a raised bed and that the affected plants were scattered throughout. So it wasn't like it was one section. It was all kind of like randomly distributed throughout the bean patch. And she first noticed the problem in the end of July, but that the problem was spreading and getting worse as the summer went on. And so to the point where her whole patch was looking rather sickly. And then the other information she had given me is that she had not done any fertilizing for these beans this year. She had added a 3-way mix to the raised garden bed before planting, and she'd not been using any pesticides. And the other important piece of information she shared with me was that she had been growing her green beans in that same raised bed for about 3 to 4 years. So I kind of gathered up all of that information and went down the path of research to try and figure out what was going on. And typically, my first go-to for problem diagnosis at the Answer Clinic is to use WSU's HortSense website. This is when, like Nigel had said, you can go onto Google and just type in WSU HortSense and it will bring you to this page. And as you can see, it covers everything. Your ornamental landscape plants, small fruits, tree fruits, vegetables, lawns, weeds, pests, you name it, they have it. And it's a really good starting point when you're trying to figure out what's going on with some of the plants. It covers diseases as well as pests that might bother your fruits and vegetables. So I clicked under vegetables and kind of went through some of the common problems that we see. And initially what I like to do is rule out any problems. So looking through HortSense and comparing what the photos the client had sent in with what I was seeing on HortSense, I was able to eliminate some things. Right away, I eliminated that this was not a pest issue. There were no bite marks or slug trails on the leaves or on the bean pods. And so I started looking at some of the other things. It didn't look like rust. It didn't match up with powdery mildew. It didn't match up with the yellow mosaic. So I was starting to eliminate from there. However, I kind of hit a brick wall because HortSense then didn't have anything that matched what I was seeing with the client's green beans. And so once I've gone through what my first step for a good handy resource, which is HortSense, then I'm going to go a little further and see what else I can find from a regional university publication. And I did find something that WSU had published on what's called a bacterial blight. And this publication was addressing more specifically commercial bean crops, but that didn't mean that the homeowner couldn't have the same issue going on in her garden. So I read the publication and it lined out exactly what I was seeing with this client. Their symptoms of the watermark spots on the beans, the necrotic dying areas surrounded by yellowing on the leaves. And from that point, I was like, okay, this is what we're dealing with. The client is looking at some type of bacterial blight in her bean patch. And because this was interesting to us, it was something new that we hadn't seen, we decided to further confirm our diagnosis by collecting samples from the client and sending them to WSU's Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory. And they were able to take those beans, culture them, and confirm that that was a bacterial blight. And so now, in the upcoming months, you will see bacterial blight listed in HortSense as a problem to be able to use HortSense as a resource. So just diagnosing the problem though, the client needed more information than that. Like, what is she going to do now? So great, I have a name for these spots on my beans. So in the future, what can the client do? Well, she can start by choosing certified disease-free seeds and varieties that are less susceptible. Another way to, especially with the bacterial blights, to prevent them reoccurring is to clean up the garden debris. If you had the blight in that garden bed one year, you want to clean up all of the debris and destroy it and not let it overwinter, because that's one way it can spread. You also want to rotate your crops when feasible for you. So the fact that the beans had been in that same spot for 3 or 4 years, it would be a good idea if she could shift them to another raised bed and grow something else in that bed. And then also to avoid overhead watering, because when you overhead water, that's another way that you're spreading that bacterial blight through to other plants. So that's kind of how it could have spread and gotten worse throughout the season. So hopefully next summer she'll be able to grow her green beans and not have any of these same issues, now that she had that information of, okay, this is what was going on and this is what I do to prevent it in upcoming growing years.
All right, this is Karen, and one of the issues I had in the last few months was a picture was sent in by a client, and this is the actual photo. They had found this dead bug in their shed, and they were mostly just kind of curious, what is it, and is it something we should worry about, basically. And I have to be quite honest that when somebody comes into the clinic, like when we do have walk-in available and they have an insect to identify, I really want to just run for the hills. Those are some of the more complicated problems. I don't consider myself an expert in insect identification. But since this is, I'm doing the answer clinic from home, and I had the luxury of just taking my time and working through it, and trying to figure out what this insect was. So it actually turned out to be kind of fun, and maybe I won't be afraid of insect ID after this. But the picture I got was really a very nice picture. It was in focus. The addition of the ruler, particularly if it's a large insect, I would say that's a very good thing to include, because one of the key identifiers for insect identification is its overall size, and that's usually the length. So that gave me a good clue as to how big this little guy was. The other key identifiers that one would use for an insect like this is how many body segments there are. As I said, its size, what are the shape of the wings, and what do the wings look like? Are they kind of the filigree type wings? The antenna, how long they are, whether or not they're segmented. In this particular case, the long stinger is a very key identifier, and the banding on the legs, the color of the legs and the banding on the legs. So I went to work on this, and one of my first thoughts was, oh, is this an ichneumon wasp? So I looked that one up, and you can see it has the 3 body segments, but one of the keys is the size of its waist, basically, the connection between the second and the third body segment. It's very different from the picture insect that was sent to me. But it does have a long stinger. It's one of the few wasps that has a long stinger. So I was able to say, no, that's not it. Also, the color banding on the body was different, as well as the legs and the antenna were different, both the color and the curvature of the antenna. This is one of the cases where something like HortSense is not very helpful unless it's something like a household type noxious insect. But I did find a website. It's a Washington State Insect ID website, and they have pictures, just tons and tons of pictures. So you can just kind of scroll through there and kind of narrow down your choices. And so I narrowed it down to a couple of options. And then I just did some further research around trying to figure out which one of those would it be. We always look for university resources as much as possible, and particularly university resources that are as near to us as we can find. And I found the University of California, their Agriculture and Natural Resource website, had some excellent information on this little guy called the horntail wasp. So I was able to look at that and really compare the shape of the body, the stinger, the antennas. It all just fit. So I determined it was a horntail wasp. So then my next thing is this a bad guy or just something you can ignore, or is it a good guy? You know, some of these insects we want to have around. They eat our aphids and things of that nature, are beneficial insects. So a horntail wasp is also called a wood wasp. It's its common name. And I found that even though they have that hideous looking stinger, they are non-stinging. They're non-invasive at all. And since they had only found one, they can probably just ignore this and not worry about a problem. The only issue that one could have with these is they do nest in dying, diseased lumber, diseased trees, I should say, so diseased or dead trees. So if a tree was, kind of on its way out and it was harvested for lumber and then used quickly in building a home or an outbuilding, and then those insect larvae could hatch after the building was put up with this diseased lumber and you be in your building. And that would be the only case where there would be a problem with these. So it certainly wasn't the problem in this case, and I would say that is probably pretty rare. So nothing to worry about, and I was able to gladly go back to the client and say, tell them all the details about this little guy, and that even though he's scary looking, it's not something they really need to worry about. And now we're going to get John. Oh, actually, now's a good time. We don't expect you to send a picture this good, but we've had 3 cases introduced. So if there are any questions, Erica can help us moderate the questions about these past 3 things.
There are none so far, but if folks want to go ahead and put those in, if you have follow-up questions, we can refer those to the presenter.
I do love this photo. Oops. Well.
Never mind.
Well, good evening. This is John. I would like to start off with a question that we get pretty commonly in the answer clinic, and it's how do I get rid of this moss in my lawn? I chose to present this one not because it's so overly complicated, but it's actually widely misunderstood. And this is the time of year that's going to start being a problem, and so it may help you out a little bit that way. One of the important things to remember about moss is that it's really not invasive, and it won't take over your lawn. It will just fill in the spaces where your turf is weak and the growing conditions are good for the moss. So in the wintertime, our turf goes into a little bit of a lag, and then the moss can get in between the spaces. So actually, moss is a symptom of that something else is wrong in your turf. So from that you can tell that the cause of moss in your lawn is that you have weak turf, because it won't show up in a good healthy stand of grass. One of the biggest culprits on that that hurts our healthy stands is shade. Another could be moisture, soggy soil that keeps the air out of the soil and robs the roots of the grass from its oxygen that it needs. The moss is a tiny plant; it's got tiny roots, so its roots are right close to the surface, so it doesn't suffer from that problem as much. Another way to cause compaction or loss of oxygen in the soil is compaction. So if there's been heavy activity, any kind of construction, or from mowing or from kids playing on it a lot, compaction can hurt your healthy stand of grass. And then low pH is also can hurt grass and help moss. Our soils here in Clark County tend to be pretty acidic. So if you're on the low side for grass, that's just about the right amount for moss to thrive. And so that can be a problem. Next slide, please. So what do we do about it? Like we said, a good stand of grass won't have moss in it. So one reason for having a bad stand of grass could be that you're not using the proper turf. Most of the new seedings of grass in our area tend to be perennial rye, sometimes with Kentucky bluegrass mixed in there. And both of those are very need a lot of sun. They don't tolerate shade very well. And if they're in shade or as the days get shorter, they're going to start suffering and become vulnerable for the moss. You can just rake that moss out with a sturdy rake, and it'll get rid of it for a while. But you're really going to have to take care of the other problems before you're going to be able to get rid of the moss. In this case, a gentleman had a nice turf, planted a tree. The tree grew, cast shade on the area, and then the grass started dying. We recommended to him that he go back to the proper turf variety. I forgot to mention, you want to try something like a fine fescue or a tall fescue that is more shade tolerant and has a better chance of surviving in our low light conditions. You can also use French drains if you have low areas or puddling, but you need to get rid of the excess water so that the soil can breathe. One way to help the breathing and get rid of compaction is to use an aerator. Here in the bottom, you see a picture of a core aerator. You can use that every year if you want to. It pulls about a 2-inch plug out of the ground and then tosses it on the top. And you leave it there because that's your valuable topsoil. What you're doing is just creating some air spaces to help out the grass, and that topsoil will just absorb back into the soil. And then finally, it seems like the culprit that the garden centers like to point out is pH. So I would say it's a good idea to check your pH and then send it off to a credible lab and then follow their directions. Unfortunately, common guidance is put lime down on your soil in this part of the country every year. The downside of that was, and in this case, the gentleman had been doing that. I suggested that, that when we do a modification of the pH with lime, that lasts for a long time. So if you're doing that every year and not ever checking your results through a lab, you can easily take the grass out of the high zone of the pH spectrum. So you're going to have to take care of of the cause before you're going to be able to get rid of the symptoms. So taking these steps, the cultural steps to fix whatever the problem is really what you need to do. In this case, we were able to thin out that tree, get rid of some branches, and overseed with a fine fescue to start trading that grass out. Next slide. So there is a chemical remedy, but I've got to stress that it's only going to be effective after you modify whatever your core problem is. You can use a commercial products like Moss X and Moss Out, and they will get rid of the moss temporarily. But you can guarantee that if the problem is not corrected, they're only a temporary fix. So, but if you do choose to use these, they're fairly safe to use, but be sure to follow those labeled directions because you can actually cause some damage. Next slide. Okay, and now we go on to the next person.
Yes, thank you. This is Becca. So another plant problem, or this was tree problem that was encountered this summer was actually in my garden. And I had a Japanese maple that would drop 80% of its leaves in just a couple of days. And I was very concerned that this was a disease issue going on with my maple tree. And this had been going on for a number of years, and I decided, you know what, I'm stuck at home, I have nothing better to do. I'm gonna figure out what's going on with this tree. So it's time to dive in to do some plant problem diagnosis and figure out what was going on. Next. So I assessed the issue. I figured out, I had to ask myself, what do I know about this tree? So what I did know is that the majority of the leaves would suddenly curl up and drop off every July and August. This year in particular, the leaves were there at the end of July. We went out of town to go see my mom for a couple days, came back, 80% of leaves dead and on the ground. So it just happened within 48, 72 hours. However, the other nearby trees and shrubs, perfectly healthy. There's a cherry tree nearby. There is a hydrangea shrub nearby. There are some hostas, some ferns. They look beautiful. I also kind of tested out the branches. I'm like, well, if the leaves are dropping, are the limbs dying as well? And so I would test the branches, and they were still really pliable and healthy. I asked myself, well, what kind of fertilizer to use? And I know that I had not put any fertilizer on this tree. And I did offer some supplemental water to this area of my garden by way of, small sprinkler over the whole area. And so then I also looked at what area of the leaves were turning brown. Kind of how did it start and progress? And so it started at the tips of the leaves and then got worse and more browning would show up. The strange thing about this, which was kind of the stumper and trying to figure out what was going on, is the maple tree would regrow all of its leaves by September. So it dropped everything, but then it would regrow them all back within a month and a half. And I'll have a photo at the very end of our presentation. I have a photo of my maple tree completely leafed back out after all of this. Next slide. So knowing all of that, I had some fears. So it maybe that's what we do sometimes because we know the worst of what can happen. We kind of fear the worst, and then we need to talk ourselves out of it. So what I feared was verticillium wilt, which is a soil-borne fungus that does affect maples. I've seen it in the clinic come in with other clients' maple trees, and so I thought, oh, okay, my Japanese maple has succumbed to verticillium wilt. So I went to Hortsense and I read about it further to kind of see, okay, what do I need to look at for verticillium wilt compared to what was I seeing on my tree? So when you're seeing verticillium wilt in a tree, you're going to see sudden yellow or brown foliage. And I'm like, okay, I have that, but it hangs on the plant. Well, my leaves were not hanging on the plant. They dropped off the tree. The symptoms of this dying foliage will only be on one side of the tree, as you see in this picture here, where one side of the tree, leaves are gone, mostly gone, kind of some are still hanging on there, and then the other side of the tree, it's still good to go. Well, my leaves were falling off throughout the entire canopy. It wasn't one limb or one area of the tree. Another issue with verticillium is that if you cut into the branches, like you see in the photo at the bottom, you're going to see these greenish to black streaks appear in the branches. And when I looked at my branches of my tree, and I did this on one of them, they were perfectly normal looking, no streaking. So I had some things going on that did not match up. And then I had other things that did match up. So this was happening in hot seasons, and the infected plants can tolerate this wilt for several seasons. So I did not feel like if I had a list of pros and cons, I don't think I had enough going to line up to diagnose that my maple tree had verticillium wilt. So it's kind of going back to the drawing board. So I had to step back again and look at the big picture and what do I know about Japanese maples. So a Japanese maple really is a shallow rooted tree. And it's not like a tree that's going to go, many, many feet into the ground. It has a shallow root system. And so that's going to require moist, well-drained soil. Also, I knew, and you might see this in your landscape, that we get these hot afternoon winds that come through in the summer, and that can dry out your leaf canopy if you have a tree that's suffering from not enough water. Kind of like a hair dryer dries your hair. So it's kind of doing that to your tree canopy. So if I'm looking at a tree that has a shallow root system, and I know I have hot afternoon suns coming through, and I'm also looking at it and saying, okay, well, there's a cherry tree nearby that looks healthy. There's a hydrangea shrub that looks nearby that looks healthy. There's hostas and ferns that are healthy. What is happening here? Well, then it finally clicked with me that this tree was being outcompeted for water by the other nearby trees and shrubs. So even though I was providing some supplemental water, I probably was not doing an adequate job for this tree. The other trees and shrubs were getting all the water. They had a deeper root system that can get further into the soil, and this poor tree was suffering for it. So what do I do to correct this problem? Because this is not going to kill my tree, but it will stress my tree and then open it up to other issues. So what I need to do in the future, and if you have an ailing tree, maybe that looks like it's suffering from some similar things, deep watering is very, very important. And actually checking to make sure that the water is getting deep into the soil. So taking a hand trowel and digging down into the soil of 6 or so inches and seeing, is the moisture getting down into the soil, into that couple top feet of soil there, and getting really good and moist for this tree. And also a layer of mulch. In a lot of our landscape plants, adding a good few inches of mulch around your landscape plants will do a number of things. Not only does it help prevent weeds, it suppresses weed growth, it also helps retain moisture in the soil. The water won't evaporate out of the soil because you've got that mulch there. And so that would make, right there, if I did those two things, it would help my maple tree next year. And if I wanted to take it one step further, I could remove those ferns and hostas because they're easily moved, and put them in another part of the yard so that there's even less competition for that tree. I can't do anything about the cherry tree or the hydrangea, but any of those smaller ground cover type plants, I should dig up and move to another location and give that tree more chance for success. Thank you.
Hello again, this is Nigel. And this is not so much as one question that came in this year, but it's a summary of many questions that come in over the course of the late spring to late summer when clients are noticing activity in the air from flying insects. It's common in late spring to field questions about honeybee swarming, some nests of bumblebees. And then later in the summer, we get the questions of the notorious stinging insects such as hornets, paper wasps, and yellow jackets. Next, please, Karen. As with most of the problems that we encounter, we do like to get a good identification. And sometimes it's pretty tricky with flying insects. They're fast to start with. It's hard to focus on them. You don't sometimes want to get close to them, for example. So if there aren't any photographs available, we ask the client to look at some of the photographs that we have. We don't actually ask clients to try to kill an insect and bring it to the clinic when the clinic's open. I think past experience has shown that that little insect gets out, or if something, it can cause a problem. So we like to see the photographs more than anything, unless there is an existing bug that's already expired. And the next slide will show you an example of a photograph that we can send to the client. Sometimes the client's not aware that there are many types of bumblebees out there, and they sometimes get a little confused with the honeybee versus some other of the flying insects. So we like to point out how they look. What you won't see in this photo is a photo of the Asian giant hornet. We've had a couple of questions about them this year, but typically we found, or in all cases, we found that they are not Asian giant hornets. The elm sawfly is actually very similar in size to the Asian giant hornet, but is totally benign. Thank you, Karen. So first of all, when we do have questions about flying insects, whether they're swarming or nesting, we inform them that most of them are benign. They are good for pollination. And we see whether the client can live with the insect colonies, whether they have to move them or whether they like them safely removed. For example, I had a bumblebee nest in my compost heap last year. I didn't know what to do about it, but we ended up leaving it alone. And then in the middle of the summer, the queen will move on and go away. And I couldn't even find a trace of the bumblebee nest when I got back to working on the compost heap. But sometimes the nest is in an inconvenient position, and bumblebees will sting if they feel threatened. So sometimes it's good to move them, and we can provide literature that will describe ways in which you can actually encourage a bumblebee colony to relocate. That's kind of fun when you can do that. It's not always possible, and just be warned again that they will sting if they feel threatened. Thank you, Karen. Other action that we can recommend to clients is that if there is a genuine honeybee swarm, then this is a very valuable entity. The Clark County Beekeepers Association would send out somebody very quickly to collect that swarm and use as a honeybee hive. So it's very, very important. Later in the season, it gets a little more dicey sometimes when the hornets and yellow jackets and wasps have gone through their life cycle or they're breeding, and they've got some of the hornets and wasps have nothing more to do than to annoy us sometimes. They literally don't. They've done their work for the year and they're just sort of building nests and just having a good old time at your picnics. But if you can live with them, if they're distant enough from where your traffic is, where your kids are playing or grandchildren picking vegetables, they will go. As you might have noticed in this fall and winter, the nests are empty now. And if there's some wasps or hornets rather, that build those rather iconic looking nests up in the rafters or the trees, like literally a hornet's nest, then there are some scientists in our area. There's one up in Longview who likes to come out, vacuum them out and take them away for medical research. I had one of these not too long ago, and it's quite a fascinating procedure to watch, where the gentleman puts a shop vac on the end of the nest, sucks them into a container and takes them away. And it's a very interesting process to watch. Finally, the Lewis County Beekeepers is an excellent web page that contains all the ID photographs and references to collectors and nest removers in the area. I think the next thing is the questions.
There are no questions right now that I haven't answered already.
And that is a picture of an Asian giant hornet.
So the next presenter would be Bob Moore again.
Okay, this is John again. This is a situation that we are seeing a lot. As a matter of fact, Erica tells me that large percentages a large percentage of the questions that are coming into the answer clinic now are about evergreens dropping their needles. The first time I dealt with this one, it threw me for a loop before I finished all my research. This is a picture of a boulevard cypress that looks like it's got a lot of problems. Next slide, please. So as we started going through the possible causes for this, we had to eliminate several factors. First of all, depending on where you are in the county, we've been experiencing a pretty severe drought for the last several years. The drought symptoms, you might think back about Becca's maple tree. You look at the top right photo here, it's kind of a general, it affects most all over the tree and affects the tips more than anything else before the tree has a really bad decline. So that didn't look like our boulevard cypress, which is down in the bottom right there. Our leaves were, our needles were turning brown, almost black, and then falling to the ground. So we thought about pests. So we'd take a look at that, see if we could find any signs of mites with the webbing, frass, chewing on leaves. We were unable to find any signs of pests there at all. So then we turned our attention to disease, looking through, trying to find necrosis, any signs of bacterial blight, twisted leaves, that sort of thing. And again, they didn't look like they had any of those kind of damage to it. And we talked a little bit about herbicide damage already. We didn't see a pattern, damage with edges on it. It seemed pretty much confined to the center part of the tree. Compaction, it could disturb the roots, prevent them from working properly, but we were able to rule that out. There hadn't been any construction, and they were in a place where nobody walked and nothing was mowed. So then we had to start thinking about this and dig a little bit deeper. We couldn't find anything that was wrong with this tree. And then we found out later that evergreens tend to well, they change out their needles constantly. They don't lose all of them at once, except for maybe larches. But every year they'll trade out the old leaves and grow some new ones. So we looked deep inside of this problem, and we noticed that it was only the older leaves that were closest to the trunk that were severely affected. So we were pretty sure that this was just a normal behavior for an evergreen. The icing on the cake of that diagnosis was the fact that we had new growth on the tips on the outside, and we had new buds out there, which made us pretty certain that this was just behavior as normal for an evergreen. Nothing was wrong. Turns out the next spring, this tree came back really well.
Okay, it's Karen, and this was one of the problems I had this spring. And this is kind of basically exactly the way it came in. A lady was kind of preparing her raised bed for her garden. She had had garden plants in that bed the previous year, so she was out getting it ready for this year, turning the soil. I think this was like April timeframe, and she found a large amounts of this, white substance. It looked like mold, and she actually sent me a few pictures, which were pretty good. It's hard to get good pictures of dirt, basically. It sort of turns into a black hole. But in the few pictures, I could see that there really were, very large clumps of this, white gunk. And she said it was actually about 1/4 of the total soil was this white stuff, and was wondering if it's safe to plant vegetables in the soil again this year, or whether she had to remove all the soil and replace it. So, I will say again, my first reaction was, oh my gosh, yuck. If I had seen that in my garden, I would also have the same questions. That does not look good. It does not look normal. But we're trained to not just go with that little gut reaction. If Erica finds us doing that, she smacks her knuckles. So I decided I had to kind of dig into this and look into it and figure out what the real story was. If any of you have, kind of house plants, in the winter, it gets a little damp, or if you have a greenhouse, you have plants out there, you'll know the surface of the pots can grow this kind of mold. But this was very different because it was all throughout the soil. It was not just on the surface. So I just started digging. Again, we like our local resources. I actually found some good information through Oregon State. And I was very pleasantly surprised to find that this is actually a very healthy bacteria. I'll see if I can pronounce it. Actimacetes. But it is a bacteria that actually processes other organic matter in the soil and creates organic matter. So it's actually a very beneficial bacteria to have in your soil. We eat yogurt, which is a beneficial bacteria, provides a beneficial bacteria in our gut. And so this is sort of like yogurt for the garden soil. So it could definitely be left in there. It was recommended that it be left. The only caveat would be that she did have some very large, dense clumps of it, and they will obstruct water flow throughout her garden. And so if a plant roots happen to be near one of those big clumps, then they may not get enough water. So it was recommended that she kind of break them up, or if she really couldn't, to just remove the big dense clumps of it. But otherwise, just leave that in there. It was a sign of very healthy soil. And this bacteria is also, if when you're working in the soil, I know a lot of us are gardeners, and we love that smell. You actually refer to it as that earthy smell. And this is the bacteria that gives soil that nice earthy smell. So it's a very good thing to find in your soil. So, this is a case where I think a lot of us who are ACEs, one of the reasons we do it is because we learn too all the time. We've gone through a lot of extra training, as Nigel indicated in the beginning, but almost every time I work the Answer Clinic, I come away with some other little nugget of information that I didn't know when I started in that morning. So it's kind of good for us too, in that sense. And now we're back to John.
Okay, this is one that came in. I've had it more than once, but the form it came in the first time was, what are these giant mosquitoes all over my outside walls? All I had to do is Google giant mosquitoes, and in about 20 seconds, I knew that these were adult crane flies. They're not related to mosquitoes in any way. In some places they're called skeeter eaters. They don't eat mosquitoes. As a matter of fact, they don't do much of anything except mate. They come out of the soil as mature adults. They mate immediately, and then they go lay their eggs, and then they die. They're dead within a matter of days. So they're not causing any damage. So it came in as a pest problem. But the further reading, said where you see these, you might want to look for other things. Of course, we've had the large insects that emerge, and they come out in the late summer and the fall. It told us to look further for thin, weak turf that gets weak in the winter but doesn't recover in the summertime, and there's no other explanation for that. And curiously, very large numbers of birds on the lawn. And that's where the client really woke up and he said, "Oh yeah, I've got tons of birds that come in every morning and just stay on my lawn." And he's talking about hundreds of birds here. So we had a pretty good feeling that we were dealing with crane flies. So we had a pest. We had to rule out, stress from drought, traffic, and compaction, and that sort of thing. And we looked very closely and couldn't find any signs of disease. Next slide, please. So the culprit was the larva of the crane fly. They're called leather jackets because of their thick, leathery skin that they have. They're about half an inch long. And they'll after the eggs are laid, after they get into this instar stage, they start eating the roots of plants, and notably grass in this case. They start eating in the fall about this time of year. So you start seeing the damage maybe about this time. Then they go into a pause when the weather gets really cold. They wake up again and start feeding again in the early spring, and then by June the damage is done. They move on to the next the pupa stage, and they stop feeding at that time. So by that time, there's nothing you can do about the damage that these guys did. There is a test you can run, and since this would be a good time to run that test if you had a problem, I'll just quickly mention that you could drench an area with soapy water, about a tablespoon per gallon. Pour it over about a square foot, let it sit for about 15 minutes, and then remove a 6-inch square about 2 inches thick from that place. Turn it upside down and see how many of these things you can find. Actually, the threshold for them is really pretty high. About 25 to 50 is considered not excessive. They won't kill your lawn in those numbers. So if you're looking at that 6-inch square, if you're seeing 6 to 12 in there, you're probably, if you've seen more than that, you've crossed the threshold into a real problem. Next slide, please. There are a few things you can do to take care of this. The cultural remedies, of course, we'd like to try those first. First of all, the crane fly eggs require moisture to survive. They can't survive in a dry environment. So the crane flies have laid their eggs there in the late summer, early fall. And if you can withhold water after Labor Day, it'll be too dry. And if you're lucky enough not to have rain, it'll be too dry for the crane fly eggs to survive, and you won't have much of a problem. Strong turf is really the key to be able to withstand an infestation of these crane flies. Dr. Alec Kowalewski, soil scientist at OSU, has got a pretty good system. He recommends that we make sure we give the lawn adequate moisture, which is about 1 inch per week within 4 small applications. So it's a shallow watering. He advises good nutrition, which is about 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet 4 times a year. And he goes by the holidays. He'll go one Easter, one Memorial Day, 4th of July, and then at Labor Day. The other thing that you might be able to use effectively is a fly swatter. These guys are pretty slow, and if they're hanging around on your walls looking for a mate, they're easy to get with the fly swatter. You can actually reduce their numbers quite a bit just by destroying them, especially if you can get them before they mate. Other remedies are biological and chemical. Studies have showed that in Western Washington, beneficial nematodes can be about 50% effective. And that may be all you need to get an infestation under control. So that's something to consider. Just keep in mind that there are different kinds of beneficial nematodes, and you need to make sure to get one that's labeled for crane flies. Side benefit of that is it also works on cucumber beetles. So if you have a problem with that, you can kill 2 bugs with 1 stone. Finally, if you just can't live with what you have, there is a chemical route. The scientists at OSU recommend products with pyrethrin in it. Some of those are organic. They're extracts from the chrysanthemum, but that doesn't mean that they're okay for all insects. They will damage beneficial insects as well if not used according to the label directions. And so anytime you use a chemical, make sure that you follow the label directions. Fall is a good time to apply this because there are a few different kinds of crane flies, but if you use your chemicals during the fall, it will disrupt the cycle of all the different kinds of crane flies. And that's all I have on that.
I'll share a couple of comments that came in. I know that we have some master gardeners from other counties on with us, and Jeff had shared with regard to wasps that one other remedy for discouraging them is to use false nests. And so if the wasps see another nest there, that would discourage them from nesting there. And then Jeff also mentions with regard to crane flies that the sampled square should not only be just from the dead area, but also include some healthy grass because that's where the larvae are feeding. And in fact, John just recently did a video for us on that and showed us exactly where he was getting that place where the healthy and the unhealthy tissue can be seen together. And that's actually a really good point to look for pests and diseases anyway. So there is another question that has come in, and it's, what is your recommended source for acquiring beneficial nematodes?
They're widely available. I've seen them at the garden centers. Quick search online will give you plenty. They're not hard to come by. They come in a package and probably sold in our local. I believe I saw some at Shorty's the other day.
Okay, thanks. That's all the questions for right now.
All right, and this is mine again. This was a problem that actually came in last fall, so it wasn't technically this year. This was before COVID, and this was a walk-in client. She had an English walnut tree and brought in a leaf sample that sort of looked like this, and she was wondering, what's wrong and what can she do to fix her walnut tree. And so the first thing I look at is these sort of angular spots all around the leaves, and then you can see where there's a lot of them, the whole leaf starts to die back. And this is a sure sign of a fungal problem. Most fungal issues sort of look like this on leaves. So that was kind of my first inclination. But because the client is standing right there, I was able to easily and quickly get more answers to questions I had. It saved the back and forth via email or phone calls. So I know walnut trees can get very big, so I didn't know, but I needed to know, how long had this tree been in? How big was it? Is it in full sun? How do they water it? And then last but not least is this the first year that this problem had been seen, or had they tried any kind of treatments? So I got all the questions to this. It was a pretty big tree. It had been there for a while. It was in pretty good full sun, and walnut trees, once they're established, don't need a lot of water, but they certainly weren't doing any overhead watering other than what Mother Nature does, and they had not done any kind of treatments. So as Becca pointed out, one of our favorite resources is HortSense, and I knew that walnuts were going to be in HortSense. So with the client standing right there, I could just quickly go into HortSense and look at what kind of diseases we would have to consider. So there are basically 4 diseases. And I actually could look at this leaf under a microscope and rule out any kind of insect damage, and they had not seen any kind of insect issues. So there are 4 diseases that are listed for walnuts: anthracnose, which is a fungal disease, black lime, blight, and thousand canker. And I just included some pictures here. Black lime is something that's in the trunk of the tree, normally at the graft union, or often at the graft union. Most, I would say probably all English walnut trees are grafted onto black walnut rootstock. And so that I could rule that out, because this was not anything seen on the trunk of the tree. It was just on the leaves. And then I could also rule out thousand canker, because that's, again, something that affects the trunks of the tree. And so by looking at all 4 things, it was very quick and easy to just narrow it down that it was walnut anthracnose, which is a fungal disease. So what immediate things that she could do, since this was a fairly new thing for them, it is perhaps something that they could solve just with good hygiene, just making sure that there's good air circulation. If there were any other trees planted near it that were starting to crowd it, maybe pruning them back, things of that nature, raking up the infected leaves that fall to the ground, get them away so that the fungal spores are not there to reinfect the tree next year. So those can help in the early stages of a fungal problem. But we all know walnut trees get huge. I've included a picture here of a full-grown walnut tree, and you can see the size of it. Homeowners are not able to apply any kind of spray to a walnut tree. So they just don't have the equipment to get to the top of it and do it safely. So it was something that, there were chemical solutions, but she would need to hire a professional, a certified professional, to come in if this required a more drastic action other than just good hygiene. So, because it was a walk-in client and we were able to quickly narrow it down and just pinpoint exactly what it was, I was able to send this client away with, a piece of paper in their hands that told them what they needed to do. And now we go back to Nigel.
Thank you, Karen. This is my last case study, and it's one of my most challenging ones I've come up with. Partly because even after being 35 years in this country, I still tend to say tomato. So please forgive me if I do say tomato. This is the tomato problem. And it's a very common question we get in the early summer especially. And it's simply a question, what's going wrong with my tomatoes? They're rotting away. And, the inclination is use your gut, but we're trained not to use your gut instinct. And so we'd like to get more information before we proclaim what we think it is. Thanks, Karen. If we can't get an example, we try to get an identification photograph. And there are some biotic causes of tomato blemishes. The fungus anthracnose, the variety of anthracnose seems to be able to infect just about anything with the fungus. That's on the left-hand side of the slide. And on the right-hand side is a bacteria spot. So if somebody says, my tomatoes are rotting, we need to get a little more information from them. Next, please. And because rot, to me, at least, as association of something, an organism attacking something else, I go through the biotic versus abiotic diagnosis pathway, and this can be a little confusing because if you talk to the client and you say, do all your tomatoes have this problem or do some not? And sometimes they're random. So we say, well, it could be biotic. And I say, well, did you wake up one morning and they were there? No, it's happened gradually. And that's another sign it could be biotic. And is everything getting affected by this rot? No, it's just usually white tomatoes. Sometimes it's a pepper, but usually it's the tomatoes. Every year I get this problem. So, okay, it could be something attacking it, a species-specific organism. Then I say, well, is it on one plant? And they said, no, it's actually, week by week, it seems to be spreading around the tomato patch. So, it could be, again, a biotic organism spreading throughout the tomato patch. Next slide, please. So we go back and look at the picture that the client has sent, and we compare it with some that could be in Hort sense. And we say, yeah, this is a rot that's developing on the bottom of the tomato, the blossom end of the tomato, which is a good clue there for those of you who know what's coming next. Next slide, please. So to cut a long story short, we know from some experience and from the vast collection of literature out there on this particular problem that it is tomato blossom end rot, which is not a biotic problem. It's actually more of a physiological, cultural, and nutrition deficiency problem. Let's see if I can explain what I mean by that. The nutrient calcium is needed to develop the cell walls at the rapidly growing blossom end of the young tomato fruit. As they're developing their cells, they need a lot of calcium to fix those walls in place, just like concrete in a building. The calcium provides structure for the cells. And sometimes, in certain circumstances, the tomato fruit does not have the means of transporting calcium to where it's needed most and when it's needed most. Just like animals, plants have vascular systems that transport nutrients around the plant and into the fruit. And this is done also by having enough water available at the right time. So you have the combination of water and a vascular system. And if that's not present, especially if the vascular system is not developed, then it's not going to get the calcium to the end of the fruit. Also, a low soil pH, around about 5.5 to 6, will actually immobilize calcium. It won't be available for transport. So you have to make sure that the soil is high enough in pH for this to occur. As John said earlier, in Clark County on the west side of the Cascades, we tend to have a lower soil pH. So this could be a sort of a widespread problem, if you will. Also, if there's not enough calcium in the soil to start with, you're not going to get enough to the end of the fruit. And a final thing that I found, which I hadn't really thought of before, was if you're developing the luxuriant canopy of the tomato, you've got all kinds of lovely green foliage developing. That is actually going to take precedence over everything else in the plant to take nutrients, including the all-important calcium. Thank you. So what advice can we give to clients when they call in and say, I've got tomato rot, we tell them, well, you've got blossom end rot. And what can we do about it? Well, by the time they've noticed it, there's very little that can be done that season, actually, but there are some things that can be done. For next season, we recommend choosing varieties that are more resistant than others and cultivars within those varieties that are labeled by the seed catalogs or the plantsman at the nursery that they're resistant to blossom end rot. For example, the plum tomatoes, the ones we use for sauce, are very susceptible to blossom end rot. And perhaps this is because their length is larger than the width, so that the calcium and the other nutrients have a long way to go to the end of the fruit, and the vascular system, as it's growing, is not able to keep up. Cherry tomatoes, on the other hand, seem to be fairly resistant to blossom end rot. Another thing to do at this time of year you can do is get a soil test. As John has also said, it's fairly simple to do, it's inexpensive, just to find out if you have enough calcium in your soil. And to be quite fair, in Clark County especially, there usually is enough calcium in the soil. But if you're growing in a container, like a hanging basket, or whether you're using some of the grow bags out there, especially if you're using something from last year, it might not have enough calcium, and then we can modify the calcium with some limestone, powdered limestone, or other nutrient additions that are available out there. If you do feel that you need to add some fertilizer, if the soil test says, oh, you need some fertilizer, just be cautious of adding too much nitrogen. We'd love to see the leafy foliage grow. We think the plant's doing great, and it is probably, but at the expense of what? At the expense of sucking up the calcium. The calcium and other nutrients are going to just rush to those growing tips. That's what the hormones do in the plant. They take what they need to grow the plant. And watering, this is something you actually can try doing if you see that early in the season you've got some blossom end rot. Just take a look at the soil. Dig a hole beside your plants, not too close, but somewhere in the tomato patch. Just dig down and see how moist the soil is, and then pour a gallon of water next to a tomato, and then see how deep down the water is reaching. We don't want it waterlogged, but we don't want it dry either. We just need a balance. And watering is one of the most skillful jobs a gardener can do in the summer, just getting the water right. Finally, on this slide, I will say that there are some options available to commercial growers that may spray liquid calcium directly onto the young fruit. But I put this there because this is something we might know about, we might not recommend to a home gardener, because to get the right kind of horticultural grade calcium is very difficult. And then recommending a dosage or a concentration level to spray onto young fruit, and it has to be done just at the right time before the fruit gets a waxy coating. It's something a commercial grower might do because they want the highest yield possible. But for a home gardener, we can recommend patience, and the next slide can indicate that. If you notice, later in the season, most of the tomatoes have outgrown this. The plant is mature, all the systems are working great. The plant is delivering everything the fruit needs to develop into a lovely, lovely, juicy tomato. Thank you. And I think Becca's up next.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to round us up with just a few quick kind of oddballs. And so we won't dive quite as deeply into these as we did the others, but they're kind of once you see them, you're going to remember them. So this one is another tomato plant with a completely different problem. The client had emailed in photos of these odd looking growths that were occurring at the base of her tomato plant. She wanted to know what they were. Next slide. So those growths are common but not serious. They're called a tomato stem primordia. They're caused by environmental factors, so that's that abiotic versus biotic that we've been talking about. So this is not a living thing causing the problem, it's a cultural issue. And essentially what those are advantageous roots. So they are root nodes that are developing along the stem at the base of the plant because of an excess of water. And if those bumps come in contact with the soil, they will establish roots. And so the tomato plant is just really, really good at making roots. So often if you've been to a Master Gardener clinic or one of our plant sales, you're going to see us recommending that when you're planting your tomato starts, you bury the plant a third to halfway into the soil. And it's this tomato stem primordia that is kind of our reasoning that we want. If you're burying your tomato start into the ground, it's going to develop more root nodes, more roots, a healthier system. It'll be able to uptake nutrients and water much more efficiently. And so we're kind of putting something that the plant does that can be odd above ground, we're putting it to good use below the soil level. Another time that we see something similar to that is on some of our fruit trees here in Western Washington, especially on some of our apple varieties, is burr knot. It's not the same as stem primordia, but it is quite similar in that it's going to be an above ground, typically right about at the where the graft, the rootstock of the apple tree. And again, these are, it looks kind of tumorish, a warty looking growth, but what it is a mass of small root initials. And what happens is this is caused either by genetics, low light, cool weather, humidity. That's Western Washington, right? Shade or cool springs and then humid times, and that can promote the growth of these burr knots. So what do we, are they really a problem? Yes, sometimes, because they can create structural weakness, stunted growth, and an entry for damaging pests. So if you're going to be planting apples in Western Washington, keep the grafting union just above the soil level to avoid that from happening, as well as don't use the tree guards on the trunk of the tree, because that can cause that low light level. Here's another really strange looking growth that we've seen in the answer clinic. It unfortunately looks like dog poop, but so anyways, next slide. This is called black knot. It is something that we find on cherry and plum trees. It's a fungus. And it starts out olive green and then it turns to a blacker color and hardens, and it expands lengthwise each year. And once you've seen it, you've kind of associated it in your mind that this, what looks like dog poo on your cherry tree could be this black knot. And this is a time of year, if you have cherries or plums, you might walk through your area with those trees and scan your trees, because once the leaves have all dropped, it exposes their branches, and so it would be easier to see. The issue with black knot is that it can kill the limbs of your trees. So while there isn't really a chemical option that we can offer for clients when they come in with this, the thing that we do recommend is that they cut the knots out of the tree. So you want to cut below 3 inches below the knot. So if you're looking at the branch and somewhere along the branch is a black knot fungus, you're going to move closer to the trunk 3 inches below the black knot, cut that, and then you want to destroy that cutting. So put it in your yard debris bin. If you have a burn pile going, put it in the garbage can. Don't put it into your compost, and make sure to clean your pruners too. You don't want to spread that from tree to tree. And we have one more for you. This is one last oddball that we've seen in the clinic, where this large mass had fallen out of a Douglas fir tree, and the client wanted to know what it was. So these are an interesting phenomenon that we can sometimes see in conifers and deciduous trees. They are witch's brooms. They're these abnormal mass of twig growth, and it can be caused by a variety of factors, such as disease or pest or genetic mutation. And what happens is you have a large number of shoots with short inner nodes that cause this growth to look like a bundle of twigs or a witch's broom. It can also be ball-shaped, like a ball, a short, it can also be a ball-shaped dwarf plant growing on the tree. And what's fascinating about these is when it's been a witch's broom caused by a genetic mutation, people will go out and collect those. And another form of, I guess, witch hunting, they're looking for these witch's brooms that have been formed by genetic mutation in conifers, and they will propagate them. And that's how we get some of our dwarf conifers that are being sold in the nurseries today. So kind of using an oddball in nature to make something new, which I think is pretty fascinating. So to close us out for the evening with some final words would be next. Just some things that you might have noticed throughout the evening that we repeat over and over again. What we do in the clinic, we make observations. What are we seeing? If it's a live sample that's brought in of a plant or a pest, or it's a photograph, we look at it, kind of talk ourselves through it. What are we seeing here in this plant, in this pest? And then we ask questions. Sometimes we're asking ourselves because we've become the client in our own gardens. Sometimes we're asking the public. But collecting those observations and questions and then turning those toward our research to come to a conclusion. You might have also noticed that sometimes some odd things require no action. The needle drop in the cedars, that's perfectly normal. It's just shedding their old needles, or those witches' brooms, or Nigel's rhododendron that had the scorch on the leaves that it learned how to adapt. So it might have been a little odd or unusual for that plant, but there's nothing that we need to do for them. That's just kind of normal, or it's adapting. We've also learned that we need to tolerate some level of pests. So just because you see a crane fly doesn't mean you need to douse your lawn with pesticides or jump straight into action. Kind of learn to assess how bad is the damage. Same with wasps or yellow jackets. They're going to go away at the end of the season. So can I tolerate them while they're there? Another important thing at the clinic is to utilize trusted sources. There is so much information out on the internet and so much good information. Unfortunately, there's also some not so good or harmful information. So as master gardeners, our go-to is trusted sources, research-based, tested. We try to go to university sources first, or other organizations, nationally accredited organizations that would have information we can hand to clients that would be reliable. Other things would be to not overlook the obvious, like with my Japanese maple. This is a picture of it here this September, after all of its leaves had grown back. I had overlooked the fact that I wasn't watering it well enough. That's a pretty obvious thing that you'd think a master gardener would know to do. But then also don't be afraid to look at less common issues that might not be the norm. It's kind of a both and thing there. And lastly, once you've kind of delved in a little deeper and you've made some observations, ask yourself some questions. If you're still stumped, send it into the answer clinic. That's what we're here for. We love to dig into these. It's kind of like detective work or solving puzzles. That's why, you know, the 45 of us who volunteer at the Clark County Answer Clinic, that's why we're there, because we love getting to the bottom of this and seeing what the answer is. So we're there 4 days a week for you, and even with COVID, we're operating remotely from our home, so you might not be able to bring in a live sample, but we're certainly there to answer any questions you have. Thank you very much.
And thank you to the four of you, Nigel, Karen, John, and Becca. That was wonderful. I really learned a lot tonight. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. And please watch your email for my message, which will include links to that survey, and also we'll invite you to get on our email list if you'd like to learn more about upcoming events that we have. Thanks, and have a good evening.